ocean looks empty and lifeless. But actually, all around are billions of tiny plants and animals called plankton. At the end of this encrusted cable are instruments used by these divers to study the plankton. The instruments act as remote eyes and allow the scientists to see the otherwise unseen creatures. Research on plankton is not always done with scuba diving. In fact, most often, the tiny creatures are studied from ocean-going research vessels, like this one from the University of Washington. Finding plankton by ship is easy, since the organisms live in the surface water just about everywhere in the world ocean. Capturing plankton is also easy. Planktonic creatures are weak swimmers, and their only real movement is to drift with the ocean currents. By towing a fine mesh net behind a slow-steaming ship, thousands of planktonic plants and animals can be captured. Nets have been the chief tool for studying plankton for decades. By net sampling at different locations and at different times of the year, scientists find out how the plankton are distributed and how their numbers and types change with the seasons. Once on deck, the collecting cup at the end of the net is removed, and the thick living slurry is poured out. Now we can finally see the plankton. Here, in a concentrated mass, are hundreds of thousands of tiny plants and animals. An eye-to-eye introduction to the plankton requires a microscope. At low power, we are able to see the animal plankton, or zooplankton. To see the even smaller plant plankton, or phytoplankton, requires higher magnification. What is revealed is a world with an almost limitless variety of shapes and forms. From the beauty of jewel-like faceting to the logical symmetry of a living geometric pattern. The most abundant phytoplankton in the ocean are diatoms. The living cell of each diatom is encased in a tiny glass box, like a pillbox, with a top and a bottom that fit snugly together. Each type of diatom has unique sculpting and ornamentation adorning the glass box. In the case of this diatom, jutting out at each end is a fierce-looking spine. Not all diatoms are individual cells. Many are colonies that form long chains or cling together as delicate pleated ribbons. Another common type of phytoplankton are dinoflagellates. Unlike most diatoms, the dinoflagellates are mobile, propelling themselves with two whip-like flagella. These very small darting cells are microflagellates. How micro are microflagellates? Well, the small dark specks moving near the microflagellate cell are individual bacteria. Although many of the phytoplankton don't look or act in a manner that most of us think is plant-like, a look inside the cell reveals chloroplasts, the green organelles of photosynthesis. Phytoplankton are the major photosynthesizing organism on Earth, more prolific than all the forests and jungles combined. Like all plants, phytoplankton need light. They maintain themselves in the surface waters of the ocean, where the sunlight is bright enough to carry on productive photosynthesis. But how are these tiny plants able to stay up near the surface? Well, these centric diatoms, for instance, make themselves more buoyant by storing oil, the orange-colored droplets scattered through the cell. This dinoflagellate is able to stay afloat by pumping heavy materials out of its body and storing light ones, making itself less dense and therefore more buoyant. For many diatoms, their sinking rate is greatly slowed by the quills, bristles, and spines that cover their glass shells. It is an elegant example of form achieving function, and as a bonus, it is also often a work of exquisite beauty. diatoms and dinoflagellates reproduce by fission, the simple division of an individual into two identical daughter cells. The abundance of phytoplankton is staggering. The average liter of surface seawater is home to about 1 million diatoms. When phytoplankton cells die, the shells drop slowly to the seafloor, where they collect as part of the bottom sediments. These are the empty shells of diatoms. In some places, the steady rain of shells has covered the seafloor with a thick blanket of these glass jewels. Dr. Benjamin Volcani is a researcher at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He is an expert on the biology of diatoms.
The diatoms and the dinoflagellates comprise the major organisms of the phytoplankton. They are the cornerstone of the food chain and the major supplier of oxygen to the earth.
Like food chains on land, the ocean food chain also begins with the plants. The diatoms have been called the grass of the sea, and that's a good way to think about them, since they are literally grazed by the plant-eating zooplankton. The ecological relationship between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton is the research specialty of Dr. Mark Huntley of Scripps. For many types of zooplankton, a recent meal is visible within their translucent bodies. Here, Dr. Huntley can clearly distinguish the dozens of diatoms that jam this young zooplankton's gut.
Zooplankton depend for their survival upon phytoplankton, microscopic, single-celled plants floating freely in the water. Most zooplankton feed directly on phytoplankton. Others are carnivores feeding on other zooplankton. The most important members of the zooplankton are copepods, microcrustaceans, which are the most abundant form of multicellular life on Earth, even more abundant than insects.
As impressive as the sheer number of copepods is the copepod's tremendous appetite. A single copepod can consume 10,000 diatoms in a day. This unrivaled display of eating is accomplished with swirls of water called feeding currents. By the rotary beating of its forward appendages, a copepod creates a current that carries a stream of phytoplankton cells to its mouth. Copepods pass through a series of larval stages before becoming adults. This copepod larva is called a nucleus. Like the adult copepod, the nucleus also dines on phytoplankton. In fact, you can see the undulating contractions of its gut as it works down a recent meal of diatoms. Copepods spend their whole life, larval and adult, as part of the plankton. They are permanent members. Another permanent member of the plankton is this larvation. Although it looks like a wriggling fish, it's not. It's an invertebrate that surrounds itself with a fragile jelly house. The larvation uses its vibrating tail to pump water through filters in the jelly house and strains out food particles. Here is a tomopterid worm, a predator on its fellow zooplankton. When it senses a prey within range, it strikes forward for the kill. Along its length are pairs of fleshy appendages called parapodia. And within this worm, you can see the spherical eggs that will hatch into the next generation. Here is an arrowworm, the sleek-bodied hunter of copepods. And this is a rotifer, one of the smallest multicelled animals on Earth. Its diatom-filled stomach shifts inside as it stretches and twists. This is a medusa, more commonly known as a jellyfish. Although it's really not a fish, the bulk of its body is a thick jelly-like starch. Medusa are carnivorous, capturing prey with stinging tentacles. The entire body of this tintinid is a single large cell protected by this goblet-shaped covering. At one end, a mass of beating cilia pulls phytoplankton from the water. Not all zooplankton live their entire life drifting with the currents. Many spend adulthood in shallow water, some among the swaying fronds of a kelp forest, and others snug in the crevices of a rocky tide pool. For many shallow water animals, the waters that carry the plankton serve as a sort of nursery, a place where the young grow and develop before returning as adults. An example of an animal that uses this temporary planktonic lifestyle is the sea star. Female and male stars release their eggs and sperm right into the seawater, where they find each other, and the eggs are fertilized. The fertilized eggs begin to divide. 2 cells, then 4, then 8, and so on. As the sea star embryo develops, it is passively carried by the tides and currents, sometimes far offshore, and sometimes distances hundreds of kilometers from where it began. Eventually, the embryo develops into a sea star larva, a tiny eating machine that continues to grow and change. After several weeks, some of these larvae end up back at the rocky coast, where they undergo a final grand metamorphosis to become adult sea stars. There are thousands of other marine animals that spend part of their life as temporary plankton. Another is the sea urchin larva. Its stiff arms and horns are held rigidly by an internal skeleton of thin limestone struts. As more limestone is added, the larva becomes heavier, and eventually it sinks out of the plankton to begin its adult life on the bottom. Here is the larva of a sandcastle worm, stretching and twisting and probing the water with its finger-like antennae. This cloak of spines begins to fall off, spine by spine, as the time approaches to leave the plankton and settle in the tide pools. The brush of cilia that blaze with motion on the larva's head creates whirlpool feeding currents that pull food particles into the animal. Although many larvae look nothing like their adult form, some do have trademark characteristics of their lineage. An example is this cyprid, a larval barnacle. A closer look reveals an adult barnacle feature, these fans of hairs, a feeding structure common to nearly all free-living barnacles. Another example is this young octopus, puffing through the water. Although its tentacles are still quite stubby, you can recognize the familiar body plan of an adult octopus. Not all the temporary plankton are immature forms of invertebrates. This is the egg of a fish, an anchovy. The egg is jammed with glistening capsules of oil, food for the developing fish inside. Some larvae are, well, active. This is a larval polychaete worm. The tufts of bristles add flotation, helping the animal stay in the surface waters. This larva, with its menacing-looking spike helmet, is a zoea, and it will grow and develop into a crab. And here is a larval sponge, beating its patch of cilia feverishly, stripping the water of phytoplankton cells. Plankton do not live at all depths in the oceans. The phytoplankton, for example, gather in the sunlit surface waters in a layer called the euphotic zone. The zooplankton, on the other hand, avoid the light. They spend daytime gathered in the darkness of deep water, tens to hundreds of meters down. At dusk, the dense swarm of zooplankton swim to the surface to graze on the rich plant food. And before daybreak, they again descend, sinking back into the depths beyond the sunlight. This curious daily commute is called vertical migration. Why the zooplankton do it is not clearly understood and is still debated by scientists. But no matter what its purpose is, the effect of the vertical migration is to keep the zooplankton in nearly constant darkness. A darkness interrupted by bursts of cold blue-green light. This is bioluminescence, or living light. These bursts of light are actually made by the zooplankton themselves. To learn about bioluminescence requires coming down to the plankton. This large sphere is a gas-filled float. Together with these encrusted cables, it forms a huge tripod on the sea floor, a stable platform where scientists can study the bioluminescent plankton. From the top of the tripod, scientists suspend a sensitive light meter protected in a waterproof housing. Lowering the meter into the darkness of deep water, researchers can now observe bioluminescence in the plankton's own backyard. The readings of the light meter are sent directly to a computer on shore. Here, the spectrum of the bioluminescence is analyzed, and scientists learn more about the ecology of the zooplankton and the blue-green glow they radiate into their dark world. As separate as the universe of the plankton seems, it is really part of a larger world. Plankton capture the sun's energy and transform it into food that fuels the marine biosphere. Without plankton, almost no ocean creature could exist. The flow of food energy begins with phytoplankton. They are eaten by zooplankton, which are eaten by small fish, which are in turn eaten by larger fish, and so on. This is a simple, linear food chain. But in addition, there are also other small food chains that involve bacteria, protozoa, fish eggs, and even whales. All of these chains interconnect to form a complex web, a food web. The dependence of the organisms in the marine food web means that a change to any one member could affect the whole web. At Scripps Institution of Oceanography, satellites are being used to monitor changes in the plankton. Ruth Wittenberg-Fay is project manager of the West Coast Fisheries Demonstration Program. Her work is part of a new era of plankton study, work that's giving us a new understanding of the ecology of the open ocean.
In the past, plankton research was only done at sea, with ships and buoys, and this was very limiting in the amount of area that could be covered. But now, with new satellite technology, we're able to get a global view of the ocean to study the dynamics of the plankton. This image shows the varying plankton concentrations off the coast of California. The highest concentrations are found along the coast. This area we've colored red. As we move offshore, the concentrations decrease. This information is very important to fishermen, as it helps them locate potentially productive areas.
Plankton-eating fish and the eaters of plankton-eating fish, like the salmon, tend to be found in the vicinity of concentrated plankton patches. Knowing where those patches are saves fishermen time and fuel. But the benefit is not just more efficient fishing. The knowledge also results in more efficient management of the ocean's resources. Each year, we utilize the resources of the sea a bit more, and so each year, we change the ocean a bit more. By changing the ocean, we may be endangering the plankton in unknown ways. This makes research on plankton even more important, because ultimately, the health of the ocean, the health of our planet, depends on the plankton.